The rain had settled over Blackwood Valley long before sunset, turning the gravel roads into ribbons of wet clay. By the time Arthur Bennett parked his old pickup beside the carriage house, the storm had soaked through the shoulders of his waxed canvas jacket. He brushed droplets from his gray beard, pulled his collar higher against the wind, and walked toward the manor. His boots left thick brown prints across the polished stone entrance. The mud clinging to them came from the eastern pasture, where he'd spent the afternoon clearing blocked drainage before the coming frost ruined the grazing fields. At 68, Arthur still insisted on doing inspections himself. Inside, warmth wrapped around him. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above a dining room that overlooked hundreds of rolling acres. Oak walls reflected the golden glow of candlelight. The long table was dressed with silver cutlery, fine china, and freshly cut white lilies. Dinner was already underway. His son, Daniel Bennett, looked up first. A quiet smile crossed his face before he stood to greet his father. Across from Daniel sat his girlfriend, Charlotte Hayes. She wore a fitted emerald dress that looked as though it had come straight from a luxury boutique. Diamond earrings sparkled beneath perfectly styled blonde hair. She studied Arthur for only a few seconds before her pleasant smile disappeared. Her eyes settled on his boots, the silence stretched. Finally, she leaned toward Daniel and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why is the groundskeeper joining us for dinner?" Every servant in the room froze. The longtime butler, Samuel, paused while placing another wineglass on the table. House manager Rebecca stopped halfway through organizing tomorrow's meeting documents. Arthur simply removed his damp coat and hung it over the back of a chair. He didn't answer. Daniel didn't either. Charlotte wrinkled her nose. "I don't mean to sound rude," she continued, "but those boots are covered in mud." Arthur glanced down. The leather was worn smooth from decades of work. Scratches covered the toes. One lace had been replaced years earlier with a simple strip of rawhide. Most people saw old boots. Arthur saw 40 years of memories. He remembered wearing them while repairing fences after storms. He remembered crossing flooded creeks to rescue trapped horses. He remembered standing beside his wife's grave while snow melted around the cemetery. Those boots had walked every acre of the land he loved. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. "The smell is ruining dinner." Arthur calmly pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down without saying a word. Daniel watched quietly. Instead of correcting her, he asked, "Who do you think he is?" Charlotte smiled confidently. "The estate caretaker." She glanced toward Arthur, "Or maybe the head gardener." Her voice carried effortless certainty. "People who work outside usually don't care much about appearances." Arthur folded his hands together. Still silent, Charlotte frowned. Would it really hurt to clean up before sitting with guests? Samuel looked toward Arthur as if waiting for permission to intervene. Arthur gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not yet." Daniel poured a glass of water. He handed it to his father before filling his own. Then he calmly asked another question. "Whose house do you think this is?" Charlotte laughed softly. "Yours, obviously." Daniel tilted his head. "Mine? Well, your family's." She smiled as though explaining something painfully obvious. "I assume your company owns everything." Arthur took a slow sip of water, cold spring water. The same spring his father had dug by hand nearly 50 years earlier. Charlotte continued talking. "This place has incredible potential." She looked around the dining hall with the calculating eyes of someone imagining future renovations. "A luxury wedding venue, a private members club, we could triple the property's value." Arthur finally spoke. His voice remained gentle. "Have you ever managed farmland?" Charlotte smiled politely. "I don't need to." She crossed her legs. "Land like this shouldn't be wasted on livestock anymore." Daniel remained expressionless. Arthur simply watched her. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows. Inside, no one noticed the quiet trap slowly closing. Charlotte believed she was impressing everyone at the table. She had no idea every sentence she spoke revealed more about her character than any introduction ever could. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, convinced she had made an excellent first impression. To her, the muddy old man sitting at the head of the table represented everything outdated: hard labor, worn clothing, and country living. She had spent years building the image of a sophisticated businesswoman, and she believed people could be measured within seconds simply by looking at them. Arthur, however, had spent nearly 7 decades learning that appearances rarely revealed the truth. He quietly sliced into his steak while listening. Daniel remained unusually calm. His father knew that look well. Since childhood, Daniel had inherited one important trait. He never rushed to judge anyone. Instead, he observed until people revealed themselves. Charlotte mistook his silence for agreement. "I've already been thinking about improvements," she said confidently. "The riding stables could become luxury guest villas. The old barns are taking up valuable space." Arthur raised his eyes. "The barns still house over 200 horses." Charlotte shrugged. "They're not profitable enough." Samuel lowered his gaze, hiding his reaction. Rebecca stopped arranging the project folders altogether. Arthur asked another simple question. "And the families who work here?" Charlotte answered without hesitation. "Businesses evolve. If positions become unnecessary, they should be eliminated." Her tone carried no cruelty, only calculation. That somehow made the words colder. Arthur rested his fork beside his plate. "When I was 23, he began quietly, "this valley looked very different." Charlotte barely listened. She assumed another old country story was coming. Arthur continued anyway. "My father worked as a stable hand. My mother cleaned kitchens for wealthy landowners. We lived in a tiny cottage near the creek where winter winds came through every crack in the walls." Daniel smiled faintly. He had heard this story dozens of times growing up. "But my father always told me one thing," Arthur said. "The land never asks who your parents were. It rewards only the hands willing to work." Charlotte nodded politely, though it was obvious she wasn't interested. Arthur continued. "When the previous owners lost everything during the recession, no bank wanted the property." He looked toward the rain outside. "Everyone said buying even 10 acres would ruin me. I borrowed every dollar I could. I worked 16 hours every day. I repaired fences myself. I planted every field. I slept in the barn because I couldn't afford heating." Charlotte offered a thin smile. "That's admirable." Her attention quickly returned to Daniel. "But things are different now." She gestured around the magnificent dining room. "This estate deserves modern leadership." Daniel folded his hands. "What does that mean?" "It means sentiment shouldn't interfere with business." She smiled confidently. "You can't keep people employed forever simply because they've worked here a long time." Samuel slowly closed his eyes. Arthur noticed, so did Daniel. Charlotte continued enthusiastically. "We should replace older staff with professionals from luxury hospitality." Rebecca's expression hardened. Samuel had served Arthur's family for 32 years. Rebecca had managed estate operations for nearly 15. Neither spoke. Arthur simply asked, "Do you believe loyalty has value?" Charlotte answered almost immediately, "Only if it improves profitability." Silence settled over the room. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Daniel looked directly at her. "What if profitability isn't the owner's highest priority?" Charlotte laughed softly. "Every owner wants maximum returns." Arthur smiled to himself. She still believed she understood the person sitting across from her. She couldn't have been more wrong. Years ago, developers had offered Arthur extraordinary amounts of money to transform the valley into luxury resorts. He had refused every offer. Instead, he expanded the farms, built affordable homes for workers, created scholarships for local students, funded a free veterinary clinic for neighboring ranches. None of those decisions produced the highest profits, but every one of them strengthened the community. Charlotte looked around again. "I'd also redesign the main house." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Oh, the decor feels traditional," she smiled. "I'd replace the antique furniture." Daniel glanced toward the massive oak dining table. His grandfather had carved it by hand. "I'd modernize the library." The shelves contained Arthur's late wife's favorite books. And honestly, she looked directly at Arthur. People wearing muddy boots shouldn't be walking through rooms like this. Daniel slowly placed his glass on the table. The quiet sound echoed through the dining room. Arthur recognized the signal. His son had nearly reached his limit. Still, Daniel remained composed. He asked one final question. "If this estate never became yours?" Charlotte blinked. "What do you mean?" If I inherited nothing, Daniel's voice stayed perfectly calm. If tomorrow I walked away from every asset connected to my family, would you still want this life with me? For the first time that evening, Charlotte hesitated. Only for a second. But Arthur noticed so did everyone else in the room. The answer she gave next would change everything. Charlotte's confident smile faded for the first time that evening. She looked at Daniel as though he had asked an impossible question. What do you mean? If you inherited nothing? Daniel rested both hands on the table. I mean exactly that. If every acre, every building, every investment disappeared tomorrow, would you still build a future with me? Charlotte forced a small laugh. That's not realistic. Answer the question. The firmness in Daniel's voice made the room feel colder. Charlotte looked around before replying. I'd have to think seriously about our future. Arthur remained silent, but inside, the answer saddened him more than it surprised him. Daniel nodded slowly. So our relationship depends on what I own? No, Charlotte replied quickly. It depends on stability. She leaned forward, eager to explain herself. I've worked too hard to build my career. I'm not interested in struggling financially. There's nothing wrong with wanting security. Arthur understood the desire for security. He had spent decades creating exactly that, not only for his family but for hundreds of employees. What troubled him wasn't Charlotte's concern about money. It was her willingness to measure people by it. Daniel asked another question. What if the owner of this estate chose to leave everything to charity? Charlotte's expression changed instantly. Why would anyone do that? It happens. She shook her head. Then we'd have to reconsider everything. The words echoed through the dining room. Samuel quietly lowered his eyes. Rebecca folded her hands behind her back. Arthur noticed Daniel exhale slowly. His son had heard everything he needed. Still, Charlotte continued talking. If we're being honest, Daniel, I've already made plans. What kind of plans? She smiled again, believing she was discussing their future together. I've been thinking about converting the Eastern Fields into an exclusive event venue. The horse barns could become boutique hotels. The workers' cottages could be demolished. Arthur looked directly at her. People live in those cottages. They could relocate. They've lived there for generations. Charlotte shrugged. Progress always requires change. Arthur's weathered hands rested quietly on the table. Those cottages had been built one by one over 25 years. He had personally paid for every brick after several employees lost their homes during devastating floods. To him, they weren't buildings. They were promises. Daniel spoke again. What about Samuel? Charlotte looked toward the elderly butler. He deserves retirement. Samuel smiled politely. I'm perfectly capable of doing my work, Miss Hayes. She ignored him. And Rebecca? Charlotte answered matter-of-factly. A younger management team would fit a luxury brand better. Rebecca remained perfectly composed, though Arthur could see the disappointment in her eyes. Daniel slowly stood from his chair. His voice remained calm. So, you've already decided who stays and who goes? Charlotte smiled. I've simply been planning ahead. Arthur finally asked. Planning for what? She answered without thinking. For when all this becomes ours. The room became completely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Daniel looked at his father. Arthur gave the slightest nod. It was enough. Daniel turned back toward Charlotte. Tell me something. She looked relieved that the conversation seemed to be returning to normal. Of course, who do you believe owns this estate? Charlotte answered immediately. The Bennett family. Daniel nodded. And specifically, she smiled confidently. You. Daniel tilted his head. Me. Well, she laughed softly. You'll own everything soon enough. Arthur picked up his water glass, not because he was thirsty, because he wanted to hide the faint sadness crossing his face. Charlotte wasn't evil. She was simply blinded by ambition. She had built an image of wealth so powerful that she could no longer recognize dignity unless it wore an expensive suit. Daniel spoke once more. And my father? Charlotte barely glanced toward Arthur. I assume he works here. What makes you think that? She pointed discreetly toward Arthur's boots. Look at him. He came straight from the fields. He dresses like the workers. He even sits with them comfortably. Arthur smiled faintly. She was right about one thing. He was comfortable among workers. He had once been one himself. Daniel walked around the table until he stood beside his father. Charlotte watched him with growing confusion. Samuel and Rebecca exchanged quiet glances. Neither moved. Arthur looked up at his son. Their eyes met. No words were needed. The moment had finally arrived. Daniel faced Charlotte one last time. His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. "There's something you should know before this dinner goes any further." Charlotte smiled uncertainly. "What is it?" Daniel rested one hand gently on Arthur's shoulder. The room fell into complete silence. No one breathed, no one moved. Charlotte stared at them, waiting. She had absolutely no idea that the next sentence would destroy every assumption she had made since walking into the house. Daniel's hand remained on Arthur's shoulder. He looked directly into Charlotte's eyes. "The man you've called a gardener all evening." He paused just long enough for every word to carry its full weight. "Is my father?" Charlotte blinked. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "Daniel, this isn't funny." "No." His voice was calm. "It isn't." She looked from Daniel to Arthur and back again. Confusion quickly turned into disbelief. "But he came in from the fields." Arthur smiled gently. "I did. He was covered in mud." "I was." Charlotte struggled to finish the sentence. "He looks like he works here." Arthur answered without anger. "I do work here." Hope briefly returned to Charlotte's face. "I knew it," Arthur continued. "I've worked on this land almost every day for over 40 years. Daniel stepped forward. "The difference is, he doesn't work for this estate. He built it." Silence crashed over the dining room. Charlotte stared at Arthur as though she had misheard. Samuel finally stepped beside Arthur. With unmistakable respect, he said, "Mr. Bennett isn't our employee. He's the owner." Rebecca nodded. "Every major decision made on this estate begins and ends with him." Charlotte's face lost all color. She looked around the room, searching for someone to laugh. No one did. Daniel continued. "My father purchased the first section with borrowed money. He expanded it acre by acre. He founded Bennett Agricultural Holdings. He owns this estate. He owns the company. And I'm simply helping manage what he built." Charlotte slowly sank back into her chair. Her hands trembled. I didn't know." Arthur looked at her kindly. "I believe that." She looked up hopefully. Relief flashed across her face. Before she could speak, Arthur added quietly, "But you never tried to know." Those words struck harder than any accusation. Charlotte swallowed. "I thought," Arthur interrupted gently, "you thought muddy boots meant poverty. You thought calloused hands meant low status. You decided who I was before asking my name." Tears gathered in Charlotte's eyes. "I'm sorry." Arthur remained calm. "Are you sorry because you insulted me, or because I turned out to be wealthy?" Charlotte opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel answered for her. "If Dad had actually been the groundskeeper, you'd still believe everything you said tonight." Charlotte covered her face. "I wasn't thinking." "No," Daniel replied. "You were. You simply believed your thoughts were acceptable." The room remained silent. Arthur looked toward Samuel. "How long have we worked together?" Samuel smiled warmly. 32 years, sir." "And Rebecca, 15. Arthur nodded. "Do you know why they've stayed?" Charlotte wiped tears from her cheeks. Arthur answered his own question. "Because people aren't disposable. When drought destroyed crops, we kept every employee. When markets collapsed, when Samuel's wife became ill, the company covered every hospital bill." Samuel lowered his head respectfully. Arthur continued, "We built this place together. No building is more valuable than the people inside it." Charlotte looked around the room. For the first time, she noticed how every employee looked at Arthur. Not with fear, not because he was rich, but with genuine respect. It was something money alone could never purchase. Daniel removed a small velvet box from his pocket. Charlotte immediately recognized it, the engagement ring. He opened the box slowly. The sapphire sparkled beneath the chandelier. His voice remained steady. "I asked you one simple question tonight. If I inherited nothing, would you stay?" Charlotte burst into tears. I was confused. Daniel shook his head. "No, you were honest." She reached toward him. "Please," he stepped back. "You spoke about firing loyal workers. You spoke about tearing down homes. You treated my father like he wasn't worthy of sitting beside you. You weren't reacting to muddy boots, you were revealing your values. Charlotte's shoulders shook as she cried. I love you. Daniel looked at her sadly. I believe you loved the future you imagined. I don't believe you loved the people who built it. The words shattered the last hope remaining in the room. Charlotte slowly removed the sapphire ring from her finger. Her trembling hand placed it gently onto the table. The soft click echoed through the silent dining room. Daniel closed the ring box without looking down. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Moonlight broke through the clouds and spread across the fields Arthur had spent a lifetime building. Inside the house, one chapter had quietly come to an end. Charlotte stood motionless, staring at the closed velvet ring box resting in the center of the table. The sapphire that had symbolized her future with Daniel no longer belonged on her hand. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she wasn't thinking about luxury, investments, or inheritance. She was thinking about the consequences of her own words. The silence in the dining room felt heavier than the storm that had raged outside only minutes before. Arthur slowly rose from his chair. Despite everything that had happened, there was no anger in his face. Years of hardship had taught him that bitterness solved nothing. Character, however, always revealed itself when people believed no one important was watching. Charlotte wiped tears from her cheeks. Mr. Bennet, I truly am sorry. Arthur looked at her with calm, thoughtful eyes. I believe you're sorry. Hope briefly returned to her expression, then he continued. But regret and respect aren't the same thing. She lowered her head. You judged a man by his clothes, his boots, and the mud on the floor. You never asked his name. You never asked what kind of life he had lived. Before you knew a single thing about me, you had already decided how much respect I deserved. Every sentence landed gently, yet each one carried undeniable truth. Charlotte couldn't argue. She remembered every dismissive comment she had made, every assumption, every careless word. Daniel stepped beside his father. I spent 8 months believing I knew who you were, he said quietly. Tonight I realized I only knew the version of yourself you wanted me to see. Charlotte looked at him through tear-filled eyes. I never meant to hurt either of you. You didn't plan to, Daniel replied. But people don't reveal their character during easy moments. They reveal it when they believe there are no consequences. The elderly butler, Samuel, quietly collected the untouched dessert plates. Rebecca gathered tomorrow's meeting folders. Neither spoke. The room itself seemed to honor the seriousness of the moment. Charlotte took one final step toward Daniel. I know I can't change tonight. She swallowed hard. But people can learn. They can. She looked hopeful again. But trust, he continued, takes years to build and only moments to lose. Those words ended every remaining possibility. Charlotte slowly picked up her handbag. Before reaching the doorway, she turned toward Arthur one last time. I hope someday you'll forgive me. Arthur offered a small, sincere smile. I already have. She looked surprised. He continued. Forgiveness doesn't always mean giving someone another place in your life. Sometimes it simply means refusing to carry resentment. Charlotte quietly nodded. Without another word, she walked through the front door and disappeared into the cool night air. The heavy oak door closed softly behind her. For several moments, no one moved. Finally, Daniel let out a long breath. I'm sorry, Dad. Arthur placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You have nothing to apologize for. I should have stopped her sooner. Arthur smiled. You wanted the truth to reveal itself. Daniel nodded. I just didn't expect it to hurt this much. Arthur looked toward the wide windows overlooking the moonlit fields. When I was your age, your grandfather taught me something I'll never forget. Daniel listened quietly. He said, the richest harvest doesn't come from the finest soil. It comes from the hands willing to care for it every single day. Arthur looked down at his weathered boots. They've been covered in mud more times than I can count. He smiled softly, and I'm proud of every stain. The next morning, before sunrise, Arthur walked back into the fields wearing the same old boots. Nothing about them had changed. The leather was still worn. The mud was still there. The laces were still uneven. Yet somehow they seemed more valuable than ever. Workers across the estate greeted him with warm smiles. Some tipped their hats. Others waved from tractors and fences. Arthur greeted every one of them by name, because to him, Wealth had never been measured by land, buildings, or company shares. It was measured by the people whose lives had grown alongside his own. As the morning sun rose over Blackwood Valley, its golden light stretched across fields built through decades of honest work, sacrifice, and unwavering integrity. Arthur smiled, adjusted the collar of his old jacket, and continued walking. The mud beneath his boots no longer looked like dirt. It looked like the foundation of everything that truly mattered.